going to share some of the approaches being implemented at the University of Virginia in order to teach emotional resilience, to increase relationship and team effectiveness, and to instill the practical skills necessary for leadership positions in what is, we would all agree, increasingly challenging environments, especially for businesses. Tim Davis is the Executive Director for Student Resilience and Leadership Development at the University of Virginia. In that role, he provides strategic direction on the university's effort to foster well-being and build leadership potential in the student community. Tim has held a variety of leadership positions at the University of Michigan and Indiana University and at the University of Dayton. He spent the first portion of his career as a manager with Procter & Gamble. He's taught numerous graduate and undergraduate courses, and he's authored book chapters and articles on topics related to leadership, resilience, and emotional wellness. So please join me in welcoming Tim Davis.
Thank you so much, Heidi. As someone with a connection to Bloomington, we've already shared about this, a place near and dear to my heart. It's always good to be introduced by a Hoosier. Just a quick note to the audience, this session is being recorded, so just keep that in mind if that's important to you in terms of what questions you ask during the other piece. So basically, I'm kind of I'm a former business guy who left industry to pursue a career in psychology, really hoping to study what helps people thrive. And in this part of my career, I'm kind of blending those two backgrounds together as a leadership psychologist, trying to help students and executives and organizations perform at their best. And that's the heart of what I do at UVA. And it's fun to get to come here and tell you a little bit about what I'm trying to make happen down in Charlottesville. So, Heidi mentioned I used to work right down the road in Cincinnati at Procter & Gamble. And so as a former marketer of consumer products, I'm just curious, does anybody have any intuitions about me in terms of what product categories I might have been marketing? Just based on pure appearance, like peanut butter, coffee, diapers. What's that? Andrew. This man is so intuitive. I was a shampoo marketer. And I got out just in time. So you do not want this guy marketing your shampoo. I thought I'd start today by actually reading a few of my notes from yesterday morning's plenary session with our excellent panel of business leaders. And here were some of the notes that I just organically took. And as I was looking back over them, I realized, wow, what a setup for today. This is amazing. So I'm just going to set the frame here with yesterday's notes. Here's what I wrote down. Today's student leaders, when they come into my company, have been successful up to this point because they've done it all themselves. They've been snarky tyrants. And as a result, they're not very liked. We have soft skill gaps, active listening gaps. They need to be better at forming relationships, managing distractions. We need to focus on the 4 C's: communication, character, credibility, courage. Drawings from my children before I left for this trip. How they snuck those in there. Tom asked, how do you teach people to accept criticism? Boy, if we could teach that, huh? How do we teach experienced people to coach other people in the organization? What about humility? These students have an intense fear of failure. What can schools do to better prepare students for group work? They're scared to take risks, ask questions, offer solutions, share opinions. How do we teach this in the classroom? And Mitch, my new friend from Sam Houston, where's Mitch? Asked the question, made a comment and a question. One of the few areas on which we in the Academy agree, and we agree on very little, is the need to do a better job of developing the soft skills. So thanks for the setup, for this morning's session. For the control enthusiasts in the room, here's a little bit of where we're going to be going in the next 45 minutes or so. We're going to talk about how well schools are preparing students for leadership success after college. We're going to, secondly, ask the question, what can we be doing better in higher ed? We're going to talk about resilience building, social emotional competencies, and maximizing co-curricular leadership opportunities. And then I'm going to, at the end, share a little bit about what this looks like from a practical standpoint at UVA on some of the things that we're experimenting with there that I hope will be helpful to you in taking something practical away from this. I hope it's an interesting talk, but I hope it's really more than that. I really do hope that everyone in the room takes some idea away that you can take back to your home institutions, to your business schools, and say, let's try that, let's give that a whirl. And if you don't come away with that, I haven't done a very good job. And if you don't come away with that at the end of the talk portion, please ask a question that helps you fetter that out for yourself. So, aside from being a terrible slide, these are the 12 most important attributes that employers told us they're looking for in a student's resume. Oh, this might be on. Sorry, I got ahead. There we go. So I thought we'd start by looking at these career readiness competencies. Excuse me. These are a set of competencies that were put together by the National Association of Colleges and Employers. And according to NACE, when they developed this framework a few years ago, this was their recommendation to higher ed, that if you're doing a good job on these competencies, then you're doing a good job of preparing our students for success after college. This is the terrible slide. Too much data, but I won't have it up there for long. These are the 12 most important attributes that employers told us they're looking for when they look at a student's resume. And this is based on NACE's 2017 Job Outlook Survey. But to help us digest this data a little bit, let me do some sorting of those attributes. So if we group the attributes in red together, what do they have in common? Question for you. Soft skills. Pick your adjective, pick your descriptor. Soft skills, non-cognitive variables, emotional social competencies. 8 of the 12 are those things. 8 of the 12 that employers tell us they are looking for in a student's resume are related to the soft skills, the EQ variables. And even if you take out strong work ethic and initiative, which I debated about a little bit, you're still at 6 of the top 12, half of them. So, how do employers think higher ed is doing at those things? Well, according to Matthew Ora, whose research on this topic appeared earlier this year in NACE's journal, he said, quote, "At the core of this angst about college, jobs, and skills is a single question. Are the nation's colleges and universities providing students with career competencies or the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required to excel in the workplace? Are we doing that?" For many observers, the answer to this question is a clear and unambiguous no. Now, in my opinion, higher ed doesn't deserve the rather harsh critique it's received recently on this front. And certainly, I don't think business schools do. And the data seems to support that. So, with the exception of global and multicultural fluency, which is a big miss, all the other career readiness competencies rated by employers in the 2017 survey are between a 3 and a 4 on a 5-point scale. Now, 3 equals somewhat proficient. And I'm sure none of us in this room are here trying to do a somewhat proficient job of preparing students for success after college. So we're doing okay, but we're not exactly blowing it out either. And look at leadership. 3.38. Not great. Well, we might be doing an okay job at preparing students for entry-level jobs or the lower levels of leadership, which happen in the first few years post-graduation. But what happens to separate highly effective leaders after graduation from average leaders? Well, there's a lot of research on this question. What separates the excellent leaders from the average leaders? What explains that variance, right? Well, looking across students and experts, I'm going to ask you all that question. Thinking across kind of all the perspectives on this question, all the studies that have been done on this question, what proportion of the variance between highly effective leaders and average leaders do you think is accounted for by IQ, intellectual intelligence? So I'll give you a little survey. I'm going to go 10, 20, 40, 68. Who thinks that it's about 10% of the variance between average and highly effective leaders that's accounted for by IQ? 10%. 20%. 40%. 60. 80. Not a dumb audience. You guys know where I'm going with this. IQ actually accounts for very little of the difference between highly effective and average leaders. About 15%. What accounts for the other 85%? Those variables that employers are telling us, please do a better job of developing the soft skills for us. And the statistics bear this out. The thing that's interesting about IQ is, unlike most of you, most people who aren't in the academy think that IQ is going to explain almost everything. Well, what we know about successful leaders is you move up in the rung, everybody's smart, right? I mean, it's hard for IQ to explain very much variance between highly effective and average leaders because there's not very much variance in IQ. Everybody's pretty brilliant at that level. So you darn well better figure out what's going to separate you from the pack and help you be most effective in your organization. And those are the soft skills. So what accounts for that other 15%? Well, IQ, but it seems to be kind of two clusters of cognitive variables. And one is pattern recognition, being able to look at data and see trends that other people might not be able to identify. And the other is systems thinking, really being able to see all the parts of a large, complex system and how they form into a gestalt. So if we're really interested in developing the most influential leaders of the next generation, we probably want to be asking how we're doing on that earlier list of the most sought-after attributes that employers are looking for on students' resumes. Essentially, emotional and social competencies. So how can we develop more effective future leaders? Well, in my opinion, we need to be thinking about three things. First, we need to be paying attention to the scientific research indicating that we can teach students to be more emotionally resilient. At my tabletop discussion yesterday, this was a great question from one of you. Can we do this? It just organically came up. Can we really teach emotional resilience? I would have said 15 years ago, we can't. As a new psychologist out of graduate school, as somebody with some business background who saw how ugly it could get, I'd say no. But we can. And the science proves that. Second, we need to be developing programs that promote the development of emotional, social competencies. And third, we need to be maximizing co-curricular leadership learning. We need to be taking advantage of the leadership activities that are already buzzing out on our campuses. and find a way to leverage those things. So let's start out with emotional resilience. What does it mean to build emotional resilience? Well, to me, it's teaching students to develop new skills that will help them persevere in the face of adversity. Skills that help them persevere in the face of adversity. And why does that matter? We're not working at counseling centers. You all are working at business schools. So why does it matter to be developing emotional resilience? Well, first, anecdotally, students seem to be less able to cope effectively today than they have in the past. I'm sure you've all seen that, and if you haven't, your student affairs folks in your schools have seen it. Second, student leaders are among the most susceptible to emotional challenges. Many of them are among the highest strung students on our campuses. They're perfectionistic. Many of them are unrealistically demanding of themselves. The way that they do leadership as an undergrad is not always healthy, and it's certainly not sustainable. And the third reason this matters is that any leader, whether a college student leader or one of our panel members yesterday, lacks emotional resilience skills, then teaching them the finer points of leadership won't make any difference. Successful leaders have to be able to experience public scrutiny and not lose confidence. They have to be able to strive and fail and not lose momentum or the drive to keep striving. In the words of Kipling, they have to be able to keep their heads about them when all about them are losing theirs. So in short, successful leaders have to be able to persevere and bounce back from setbacks. So let's first talk a little bit about that first presupposition I mentioned earlier, which is that students are less emotionally resilient today than they used to be. Well, we really don't know the answer to that question because we don't have longitudinal data on resilience. What we do have longitudinal data on is student mental health. So let's use that as a proxy. So this is data from the 2016 survey of University Counseling Center directors. And as you can see, anxiety and depression, it's kind of clever that they put depression on in the blue color, isn't it? Anxiety and depression have been on the rise for the last 8 years. Now, as a clinical psychologist and a former counseling center director, I can attest that university counseling centers are looking progressively more and more like crisis centers. Are students really less resilient? Well, we know that the average age of onset of a first major depressive episode has gone from age 30 to age 15. We know that the emotional well-being of incoming college freshmen is at an all-time low in the 32-year history of that survey. So how are business students coping? Well, let me ask you guys. What do you think, in general, are business students' favorite flawed coping mechanism? What do they do to cope with the anxiety, the depression, the pressure that they're feeling, their adjustment difficulties? Yeah. Drinking. Yeah. So alcohol among business students, and this is not published data, this is just data that I've seen and collected in my experience as a counseling center director in my former career in higher ed. But business students are statistically significantly, measurably more likely to abuse alcohol than students who are studying other disciplines. Interestingly, they are significantly less likely to report that it's a problem. That's the power of culture, because that's the norm. Unfortunately, that's the norm in our business schools. They're strung out, they're perfectionistic, they're worried, they're taxed, and they're boozing it up, and they don't see a problem with that. So we're also getting first-year students, actually first through fifth and sixth-year students, at a developmentally critical time in their development. Now, to understand better what makes this a critical time in their development, we're going to build a little model of the brain. You're going to build a little model of the brain. I bet you didn't know that when you came into the room today. You're going to build a brain model right now. You're going to do it with your hand. So everybody get out the brain on the end of your arm. Just open up your hand. I want you to tuck your thumb into the palm of your hand. Close your fingers around it. And you have a human brain. Congratulations. You did it. Now, keeping your brain up in the air, your wrist and your forearm, that's your brainstem. That's the oldest of the three general areas of the brain. It's what we call the reptilian brain. This part of the brain we have in common with all kinds of undesirable animals that crawl all over the earth. All right? This is the part of our brain that makes us attack or slither out of the room. It controls the vital functions of heart rate, breathing, and body temperature, balance, those basic survival things. Now, open up your fingers, and down in there, your thumb, in the middle, that's your limbic system. Right? This part of the brain first appeared in mammals, and it contains the emotional center of the brain. That's important. The thumb is the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain. It contains the amygdala, which is really what we think is really the heart, the core of the emotional center of the brain. Put your fingers back around your limbic system. Your fingers are your cerebral cortex, the home of rationale and objectivity. It's the rational center of the brain. This is what makes us distinctly human and separates us most clearly from other life forms. So here's the thing. The limbic system, your thumb, down there buried underneath your cerebral cortex, that is overdeveloped in college students. The limbic system, the amygdala, that is light years ahead of the cerebral cortex, specifically the prefrontal region. So by the way, this is an orientation to your brain, okay? This is your prefrontal cortex, your cerebral cortex, your fingertips. That's right here, above your eyes, and your prefrontal lobe. So their limbic system is overdeveloped relative to their prefrontal cortex, which is the home of rationale and objectivity. So what's the implication for college students if the students in your classrooms and coming into your offices every day have emotional centers that are overdeveloped and rational centers of their brain that are underdeveloped? Implications? Anybody?
Coping problems.
Big coping problems. What else?
Irrational behavior.
Irrational behavior. Impulsivity.
They can't see consequences out to the behavior.
Absolutely, John. They can't see beyond the next 5 minutes, right? It's interesting. It's really interesting, the research on this. That's a great point. And let me clarify. They can actually see beyond the next 5 minutes. They can cognitively identify what might happen if I drive a car at 85 miles an hour on a curvy road, right? Here's the thing that's different from us. It doesn't load on their decision making. They can see it with their prefrontal lobe, but their amygdala, their limbic system, is running the show. So if it feels good in the moment, I do it. There's a separation. That's the gap. Those two parts of their brains aren't wired together yet. So a couple years ago, to give you a little anecdotal example, just checking the time. Give you a little anecdotal example. I was working with a second-year student who was really locked in on getting into our undergraduate business program in the McIntyre School at UVA. And he knew his candidacy was not a sure thing. And he became progressively more anxious and more fearful that he wasn't going to get in. And I could see his amygdala was taking over his brain. And he became convinced that if he wasn't admitted to McIntyre, his professional future would be so compromised that he would never recover. Talk about not being able to see, or at least factor in, more than 5 minutes, 5 days ahead. He eventually shared with me, just prior to going on spring break, that if he found out over spring break he wasn't admitted, he might not be able to keep himself safe. Now, things turned out okay for this kid. Thank goodness he was admitted. But not exactly a good forecast of what's ahead for him. But it did turn out okay. But what a powerful example of the toxicity of this risky period that we just talked about. So this is just, for me, a helpful little graphic of the way that the development of the limbic regions outpace the development of the prefrontal cortex. And while there's that separation in the development of those two parts of the brain, they're living in a risky period. Guess what? This is when we have it. For better or worse. You look really concerned. You have a question?
No, but I'm thinking, I'm 100 years old, I'm sure, but didn't we have that same problem?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
It's not like this is a new.
No, it's not a new thing. What's new is that students seem to be dealing with a lot more emotional intensity than they used to. The development of their brains not necessarily different, although I will tell you there's a lot of people out there starting to look at the new behaviors and habits of young adults. Matt talked about it yesterday. What did he keep holding up? iPhones, technology. There's a lot of people, anecdotally, I have a good friend who's the chief sports psychologist at UVA who's done a talk on this, that the use of technology and is impacting the young adult brain. And that the retrieval of data and the solving of problems has become so easy that the parts of their brains that would otherwise be developing if they were up in the stacks for 5 hours trying to find one research article and problem solving with interlibrary loan because it's in Los Angeles instead of Charlottesville, and they were having to go through all those motions, that they would be neurologically getting tuned up for adulthood in a way that they don't have to now. Now that's theory. I don't know how much is there or not, but that might be what constitutes the difference.
Well, no, and there's this study that said we used to go to Starbucks and have to stand in line. Now we just pull out our phone. We used to have to think or do, processed other things that we don't process.
Absolutely. So this is fun to talk about. Now I've got to start to puff it a little bit. So how do we build more emotional resilience in our students? Well, first, we need to be tapping the field of positive psychology. For those of you who aren't familiar with positive psychology, it's basically the scientific study of strengths. Strengths that enable individuals and communities and organizations to thrive. Positive psychology is really a response to the establishment in psychology who believed for a long time, and many of them still do, that emotional health can be attained through the study of mental illness. Positive psychology put forth the idea that when we help people value what's right with them, they're much less likely to experience the manifestations of anything that's wrong with them. And Martin Seligman, who's really considered the father of positive psychology, has done a ton of groundbreaking research at the University of Pennsylvania and has brought scientific rigor to the study of positive psychology. And he's proven unequivocally, scientifically, that resilience can be taught, to answer the question at my tabletop discussion yesterday. And this is consistent with what we know about neuroplasticity. That when we learn something new, when we practice it, and by the way, this is true for everybody in this room. Neuroplasticity tells us that when we learn something new and we practice it and we talk about it and we exhibit interest in it, we form new networks, new structures in our brains. And those structures facilitate new habits, new behaviors, new beliefs. This is a good message, folks. This means that all of us, within a reasonable band, can change. College students, whose brains are extraordinarily malleable in the period from about 16 to age 24, are especially adaptive at being able to change. Might not look like it, but the neuroscience tells us otherwise. A big part of positive psychology is teaching and developing optimism. This is what Tom Murray sat up here yesterday and said to us. Tom asked all of us in yesterday's plenary session, he said, I'd love it if we could teach abundance, to see the world in terms of abundance rather than scarcity. Now, before all of you roll your eyes, power of positive thinking, can't take it. I left my bark bag on the plane. That's not where we're going. Optimism is not a Pollyanna, happy at all costs mindset. We know, every one of us in this room knows, that just pasting a smiley face on yourself when things are really bad does not foster your resilience. Sometimes it even makes it worse. I need to not be telling little stories because I'm going to run out of time, but I used to work across the hall from one of the nicest people I've ever met. Great psychologist, good person, but every time he ended a psychotherapy session, he would stick his head out the window, or out the door, at his student walking down the hall, and he'd say, "Keep smiling." And I'd be across the hall going, "Oh, please don't say that." You know, the student's probably been talking about something that's heartbreaking, that they can't even remotely see some help for, and telling somebody that keeps smiling doesn't get it done. It actually just produces guilt for not feeling better already. Optimism is a predisposition to see what is happening that's good, that's beautiful, and has the potential for growth. Optimists don't just focus on what's going right in their lives. They're objective. They can see the cloud. It isn't that they don't see problems or negative forces. They just choose to focus on things that A, are under their control, and B, have the potential for positive outcomes. So can we teach optimism? Yeah, we think we can. So we've talked about positive psychology and its role in producing more emotional resilience in our students. So how else do we teach resilience? Well, one is by teaching growth mindset. Growth mindset comes out of Carol Dweck's work at Stanford. Growth mindset is basically the belief that our skills and our competencies of students and of everyone in this room can be developed through effort and a preference for complex, difficult work. That's a key tagline. A preference for complex and difficult work. And the incentives for adopting a growth mindset appear to include increasing your intellectual intelligence. You get that message through to students, and they're listening. We teach emotional resilience by teaching a strengths focus. We explore the positive outcomes from using a strengths-based focus with ourselves and our own personal self-reflections, and in the way we evaluate others and our communities and our organizations. We teach emotional resilience by helping students look at cognitive biases, by creating awareness of the cognitive biases that make us so much dumber than we have to be. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias, by the way, is at the heart of so much of the suffering that we go through personally, organizationally, professionally. If we can shift that even a little bit, the returns are huge. Attribution bias, negativity bias, in-group bias, all these things that we are programmed unconsciously to have going on in our brains that get in the way of good decisions, that get in the way of objectivity, that get in the way of being the people that we want to be. And we create awareness around those things. Mind traps, our own idiosyncratic cognitive distortions. What are they? If we don't know what they are, we can't help students work through them, right? So helping them look at their own personal sets of mind traps. Core self-beliefs, the things that we believe very deep within ourselves about ourselves and the world that can either thrust them forward in a wonderfully positive direction or can create the kind of drag that sometimes they don't recover from. Mindful and attentional practices that support physiological coherence. So, I'm going to skip this part, a little bit more neuroscience on how teaching emotional resilience has positive impacts on the brain, but I'm just going to leave it there for now, for time's sake. But here's what we know. By teaching students new ways of coping with strong emotion, just know this, by teaching students new ways of dealing with strong emotion, whether it's by diffusing mind traps, or introducing their cognitive biases, or helping them develop some attentional practices and some mindful practices, we are helping them to rewire their brains, to connect the left prefrontal cortex with the limbic system and the amygdala in a way that helps them control intense emotion and become more emotionally intelligent. So I want to say a little bit, where did I put my clicker? There it is. I want to say a little bit about one of the areas on which I focus in my resilience training, and that's coherence. The Institute of HeartMath has done a ton of research in this area, and what they've shown is that generating sustained positive emotions facilitates a body-wide shift into a scientifically measurable state called psychophysiological coherence. This state of coherence is characterized by increased order and harmony in our mental and our emotional and our physiological processes. And a number of important physiological changes occur during coherence, including the two branches of our autonomic nervous system synchronize with one another. The sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, kind of the accelerator for our life and the brake for our life. And they get in tandem. A number of different bodily systems synchronize to the rhythm generated by the heart, including respiration and blood pressure. Things get in rhythm. And finally, there's increased synchronization between the activity of the heart in the activity of the brain. You'd think it's a given. It's not. So with all that happening, it's no wonder that positive emotions feel so good. So when students are frustrated, their heart rate variability, which by the way is different from heart rate, we're not going to go into all that this morning, but their heart rate variability, the speed of their heartbeat second to second, looks like the top line. Actually, that top line is relatively close to what our normal state looks like. This might even be what it looks like for you in the room this morning. There's many times that I'll be monitoring someone's heart rate variability, a student's heart rate variability, and I'll just look at them and say, tell me about your day so far. And this is what we get. This is tell me about your day. So that pattern indicates physiological incoherence. The heart rate can't regulate. The sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are fighting with one another. Rev up, calm down, rev up, calm down. Be scared, be relaxed. Breathing is shallow and irregular. But with some basic instruction, guided thinking, and breathing practices, we can get students' heart rate variability to look like the bottom line. And that is a grounded and calm, but alert state in which many of the body's physical and emotional systems fall into rhythm with one another. Now, getting from that top line to the bottom line is a set of skills that we can teach. We can teach this. Look, it's amazing. And think how important that kind of teaching is to aspiring leaders. To be able to take themselves into a grounded, clear thinking, objective, and alert space, even while having an emotionally intense meeting. So we've talked about building emotional resilience in students. Now let's talk about developing emotional and social competencies. Now remember what the employers seek on a student's resume slide said, all those emotional social competencies. Here they are again. Well, NACE is not the only organization proclaiming the importance of these emotional social competencies. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development touts the importance of non-cognitive skills in fostering lifetime success. And they focus on what psychologists call the Big Five. Some of you might be familiar with that. The Big Five personality traits. How great would it be to teach some of these? Openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, which just basically means the whole range of how we connect with people and how we don't. Agreeableness and emotional stability. These next couple of slides, I'm just going to buzz through, but just know that there's a lot of organizations out there that we know and we respect, including the National Research Council, who are imploring us to move in this direction in our work with students. My UVA colleague over at Darden, Ed Hess, I don't know if anybody in here knows Ed or not, but Ed just published a new book called Humility is the New Smart, in which he convincingly articulates that we are headed for what he calls a technological tsunami that will be as disruptive for us as the Industrial Revolution was for our ancestors. He cites data indicating that 47% of the U.S. job market, 80 million U.S. workers, will be eliminated by robotics, nanotechnology, mapping of the human brain, and biomedical, genetic, and cyborg engineering. Ed predicts that humans will have to excel at the skills that machines can't do well, including the kind of high emotional intelligence that fosters relationship building and meaningful collaboration. to have a place in the workforce, no less be a leader in this new economy, we will have to outperform the smart machines that, unlike us, have no egos, no emotional defensiveness, no fears of making mistakes or looking stupid, no worries about not being liked. So what will we and our students need to do to compete in this new economy? Well, according to Ed, 4 things. Quiet our egos. If anybody's got any tips, I'm open. Managing ourselves, our thinking and our emotions. Becoming masters of reflective listening. And developing a profound sense of otherness. So how are we doing at our home institutions at teaching these competencies? So where specifically do students and leaders need the most help in developing emotional social competencies? Well, from my perspective, in 3 areas. First is in learning to have difficult conversations. In my private work, coaching executive leaders, I'm repeatedly surprised when, after some relatively intense work around the interpersonal and political complexities in their organizations, they look up exasperated and they say, I just don't like conflict. Right? This has happened to me twice in just the past couple of weeks with some seasoned CEOs. And it's not only that they don't like conflict, they don't know how to have conflict. It's not that they're not capable, they just don't have the skills. Nobody taught them in business school. Nobody taught them during their liberal arts educations. And these are seasoned adult leaders. But being able to have difficult conversations has everything to do with the leader's ability to manage challenging group dynamics, to manage teams, to address problematic behaviors, and to navigate the interpersonal dynamics that can either foster or destroy healthy organizational norms. And if seasoned leaders that I consult and coach with can't do it, how do we expect our students to do it? How do we expect them to come out of the gate without those life experiences and engage in these kind of critical leadership behaviors? Second, developing emotional resilience skills. We already identified that as a whole separate part of what we need to do better. But emotional resilience is part of emotional and social competence. So I just want to name it here as part of this rubric. We need to be better at helping students get past challenge avoidance. Many students, at least at UVA, live out their undergraduate experiences defensively, collecting only classes and activities that have the highest chance of success and eschewing more challenging endeavors. I was recently in a meeting with one of my advisees who wanted to take a class in Russian because she thought it would be intriguing. She thought she'd enjoy it. It might open up a new area of interest. And of course, I encouraged her to do it. But she sat there with her furrowed brow, deliberating, thinking so hard. And eventually she looked up and she said, I can't afford the chance of taking a B. And she passed on the class. We have to spread the good news of how a growth mindset or a positive inclination to doing things that are hard, that have a relatively high chance of making students feel stupid, predicts a plethora of positive, emotional, and professional outcomes. So the third area that we could be doing better, the first two being building emotional resilience and developing emotional social competencies, is maximizing co-curricular leadership learning. College student organizations are a perfect leadership learning lab for emerging leaders. and potentially provide the kind of high-impact leadership learning that we are all trying to recreate in our classrooms. It's already going on out there. We have to tap into it. Those leadership organizations, those student organizations, offer a low-risk preview of organizational leadership after college. So these are just some of the recent themes that I have worked with at both the student leader level and privately at the CEO level in just the past 6 months or so. I hear both populations asking, how do I and my executive team make a positive impact on the culture of my entire organization? Students and CEOs. How do I know when to stay in the clouds, strategic, and move into the weeds? How do I confront my leader on the fact that his priorities are flavor of the month and disrupt the momentum of ongoing projects? How do I make this a great place to work and still hold people accountable to very high expectations? How do I empower my team to make decisions when I believe at my core that I already have the right answers? Students and CEOs. Isn't that cool? I mean, isn't that neat to think that students are struggling with a lot of the same things that CEOs are still trying to figure out? And we can help them while they're still on our campuses, in those live learning labs out on our campuses. But to really help students benefit from those difficult leadership dilemmas that they're experiencing in their student organizations, we have to give them the frameworks for managing these marvelous struggles. But that kind of deep leadership learning is not a byproduct of just being involved on our campuses. Student leaders need support, they need consultation, and they need frameworks to help them make sense of and integrate those experiences. So how do we do that for them? In my experience, there's no more effective means of doing this than leadership coaching. At the individual level, I do some of this work with student leaders, and one that's coming up for me as I'm talking this morning is a student. He's a guide. It's funny how different programs at universities take on all this status, but at UVA, one of the high status organizations are the university guides, the people that give tours. And you have to be accepted in this organization. You have to work for 4 years doing this to rise to the executive committee level, and it's a big deal. Well, I'm working with one of those students, and when we sit down together, and he tells me about what he's struggling with, primarily trying to keep his ego in check, it looks like nothing's happening. Invariably, I end those sessions, I think, is that really a good use of my time? But I often hear back from him, it's usually a week or 2 weeks later, and he tells me about how helpful those sessions are in helping to be more effective in his organization. And I know what's happening. He's borrowing my roadmap. He's borrowing my life experience that he doesn't have yet. He is channeling my prefrontal cortex and wiring it to his limbic system. And by the way, we know that's what happens. When students are mentored, when students are coached, when students have a sounding board who can give them objective perspective on their interpersonal challenges, we are producing regulatory fibers. This is not metaphorical. We are producing regulatory fibers that connect and integrate the various parts of their brains that would otherwise take many more years to connect. Team coaching. Team coaching is an area that, if you're not hearing about it yet, is starting to explode. Because when you have a leadership team together, an executive team together, and as a coach, you can see the dynamics playing out. And you can coach the leader live, and you can ask while something's flaring between two factions of this committee. And you can go to the leader and you say, how do you feel like this conversation's going? And coach that person on managing what's happening live. And coach the team on more effective ways of navigating their differences and their tensions and their competing agendas. That is the kind of live, high-impact, experiential learning that cannot be replicated in any other way, shape, or form, in my experience. It's also really efficient because you can spend some time with a group of people live and really have an impact on more than just one person at a time. peer-to-peer coaching. This is something I have not gotten out of the gate yet with at UVA, but peer-to-peer coaching is scalable. Leadership coaching is a sexy term for undergraduates. They're curious. They want to learn it. And a school that's done a really nice job, I don't know if we have anybody from Northwestern in here, but Northwestern's Center on Leadership, which is part of their McCormick School of Engineering, has done a great job of putting together a scalable model using undergraduates, graduate fellows, and faculty who are interested in developing coaching skills. And the efficacy of coaching is impressive. There's a reason that coaching is a $1 billion industry in the US alone. A recent global survey of coaching clients by PricewaterhouseCoopers concluded that the mean ROI for companies investing in coaching was 7 times the original investment. And a quarter of the companies investing in coaching reported ROI of 10 to 49 times original investment. Now, generally speaking, corporations don't spend that much money on things that don't work. But those are the kind of interventions that we can use while we've still got them, while their brains are still malleable, while they're still on our grounds. And lastly, I just want to take a minute and kind of operationalize a little bit of the work at UVA in a practical sense, explain a little bit about what that looks like. I've just divided it into stakeholder groups for me. And for me, much like you, my most important stakeholder group are the students. So with the individual students, I teach a first-year seminar called The Resilient Leader, and it's focused squarely on the intersection of emotional resilience skills and leadership skills. And we keep that in our crosshairs the whole fall semester, first year. I teach a 3-credit course on resilient team leadership, the things that we just talked about that are happening on executive boards and in groups of people, group dynamics. We integrate a lot of different leaders from different parts of the university, especially student athletes. There's a lot that we can learn from student athletes and what persuasion and influence and leadership looks like on an athletic field to the rest of campus, and vice versa. So we try to cross-pollinate different team leaders on grounds. Faculty and staff are a really important stakeholder group of mine. So I had a lot of fun this year developing an entire emotional resilience building curriculum just for faculty and staff. A 10-session model. And not all faculty are willing to go through a 10-session model of resilience building. So I keep it flexible, break pieces off, do what works for different departments. But the basic idea is this. We're not going to do a good job of teaching students about emotional resilience if we don't have a lot of those skills in our own repertoire. So it's a very experiential approach to faculty and staff, helping them to look at their own emotional resilience and what skills they can develop to be more effective in their professional life and in their personal life, and then trust that that's going to bleed over into their work with students. And in the community. So I do a lot of one-off work, a lot of leadership retreats, 360s with student groups that want them. Trying something different this summer, which is to do a programmatic intervention with all the families that come through Charlottesville for summer orientation, getting ready to send their students to us in the fall. And we do a little bit of systems work. What can you as a family system, as parents, be doing in the last 2 months that you've got to launch them successfully into college? Because the influence that the family systems have, obviously, for these students, far outweighs the influence that we have once they come to our campuses. So I'm going to wrap there because I'm a few minutes early. I do want to leave at least 15 minutes for questions. That's a little bit of what it looks like. And if you have more questions about the practical elements of what's happening at UVA, feel free to ask.
Why don't we take questions? Great. Microphone, so you're ready.
And by the way, I tried to put together a pretty extensive list of references, so whatever I mentioned or talked about should be in the references in the slides, which will be on the convention site.
So one of the things that I have noticed is that some of this anxiety results in students cheating. They get time pressed in particular. I think there are a lot of demands on their time, particularly for student athletes and who are very, very, very good students, but just don't have the time to do things, and they end up trying to pull something off the internet or something to meet their obligations. So how do you have that dialogue with students about how to manage some of their anxiety and what, to get that so that they're not making those types of choices?
Yeah, thank you. And when people ask questions, can you just say your name and institution?
Kathleen Hanley, I'm at Lehigh University.
Okay, thanks, Kathleen. So interestingly, I mentioned Carol Dweck, who's done some really, really important research at Stanford on growth mindset. And the flip side of growth mindset is fixed mindset. Here's what her research says about cheating. Which mindset do you think is more inclined to cheat on an exam? People who are fixed, believing that their traits are set in stone, or growth, believing that their skills and capabilities can be developed with effort? Fixed, exactly. When students believe that they come to your universities as a finished product, the stakes are excruciatingly high, because what they got is what they got. And the research says that when they believe their traits are fixed, they're more likely to cheat on an exam. So one of the interventions that I would say, Kathleen, is important is to read up on Carol Dweck's work a little bit. Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K. And what she has shown is that with students who are fixed mindset, and by the way, most of us are brought up with a fixed mindset. I mean, until 15 or 20 years ago, we thought that once we gave someone, has anybody ever gotten an IQ test? I mean, for me, it was terrifying, because I'm like, well, that's it. God help that, let this be 3 digits. But we know that's not true anymore. That's just a point in time. And when we show students what's happening in the brain, that if they can develop a preference for complex work and a tolerance for work that makes them feel dumb, they can get smarter, they're hooked. So if we can move them into more of that growth mindset orientation, I think that might be one of the most effective ways of lowering the stakes such that cheating doesn't look like a good option.
Mitchell Lee, Sam Houston State. Tim, thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation.
You're welcome.
There is no single group at the university more influential than our faculty. The students hold them in such awe. They aspire to reach their level of intelligence and proficiency. And so they hold great sway in the students' view of themselves. You mentioned some things faculty can do to leverage co-curricular activities, that encouragement. You talk about team projects and group projects. If you're talking about the faculty member in general, who may not be teaching a course on personal growth, may not be teaching a course on leadership, they still have an impact on every individual student in their class. Are there some little tips that we can share with our faculty to raise their awareness of the importance of their activities as role models, to emphasize their influence on developing leaders, even if their course is not about leadership?
Sure. Well, I mean, one thing, there's a lot I would say, Mitch. One is, I'd want to be able to talk about this to all the faculty. I'd want to give them, faculty are convinced usually by data, right? I hope I shared some data with you that's pretty convincing in terms of how developing emotional resilience in students and emotional social competencies predicts the kind of positive outcomes that we're really trying to kill ourselves to get them to. So I'd start with a convincing set of data. The second thing is, I would encourage faculty to do some professional development around emotional resilience skill building. Look, I mean, everybody in this room is really smart, but not all of us are emotionally resilient. I have my moments, right? My wife was out of town 3 weeks ago, got 3 kids under 15. They were driving me absolutely wacko, right? I flipped my lid, my prefrontal cortex disconnected from my amygdala. I spouted off at them. You know what I did? I mean, I lost it because I went in the bedroom, I closed the door, I curled up in the fetal position, and I slept for an hour. Right? So maybe that's emotional resilience, maybe it's not, I don't know.
You didn't hurt anybody.
I did not hurt anybody. I reemerged an hour later. I said to my kids, I'm sorry I was a jerk, but I'm just letting you know I'm going to be a jerk for the rest of the day. But I'm doing my best. And those are the kind of moments and skills or lack of skills that all of us as faculty and staff deal with. I would try to get faculty hooked on how not only looking at their own levels of emotional resilience and skill building could be helpful to students, but how it can be helpful in their own professional life and in their own personal life. And I look at it from a professional development standpoint. If you can start to create a little bit of an interest in developing that kind of culture within your schools, that will translate into their work with students. You don't even have to tell them how it translates. It just will.
Kathy Petroni from Michigan State University.
Hey, Kathy.
Hi. I just was interested in your discussion about optimism. My sense of optimism, and I've actually done a little bit of research on it, is that it's a bias, right?
Yeah.
And on average, human beings are optimistic. We overstate the likelihood of desirable outcomes. And this is actually an evolutionary response. People that are optimistic tend to be happier, do better in society in typical ways that we measure them. The lack of optimism is depression, which is actually, some might say, an illness. And we have biases that actually, these cognitive biases that you refer to, actually lead us to be optimistic. I mean, it's been shown there's part of our brains that ignore news that's bad because we, have this inner way of blocking it out and staying optimistic. So I just thought it was interesting that you didn't sort of frame it as it was a bias, and that there's other biases that we need to teach students about. But optimism itself is a bias.
Well, I do think it's a bias,
It's a
and
good bias.
Kathy, and it's a good, for those of us who have an optimistic bias, it's a really good thing, and I'd love to talk more about some of what you've seen in your exploration of the research. That'd be fun. Some of what I've seen is a little bit the flip side of that. That from an evolutionary standpoint, many of us have difficulty seeing the optimistic side of things, the things that have potential for beauty and positivity and change, because we're kind of programmed to be fearful. And fear works. It's not very enlightened, but it works. And so, I think the bias can cut both ways. How we're pre-programmed, I guess it depends on which data you look at. There's a lot that I've seen that says we're a little bit pre-programmed to some of the things that make us clinically anxious and prone to depression, which is why teaching people to have an optimistic bias is so important and is actually doable.
Yeah, and people that are biased, that are real optimistic, in order to make them not be optimistic, you actually have to put electromagnets in certain parts of the brain.
Yeah, there's a lot to that. Electroconvulsive therapy is making a comeback for those of you who aren't aware, for better or worse. I think we've got time for one more question.
Good morning, I'm Elaine Kent from Capital University. We're the other university here in Columbus.
Yeah.
And one of the problems we've seen within the past 5 to 10 years in our school of management is that so many of our students work, and they have to work. And that really conflicts with getting them involved with student campus activities, leadership opportunities, and student organizations. We used to have an accounting organization, it no longer exists. We used used to have women in business, no longer exists. And we're just wondering what ideas you might have. Thank you.
Sorry, can you just be a little more specific? Ideas about how?
How to encourage them to get more involved with co-curricular activities.
Ah, okay. Gosh, that's tough. I mean, it sounds like you are working with a population of students who, on the hierarchy of needs are trying to survive and get by. And I think it's a tough argument to say, well, you should be involved in the guides program, right? If you're trying to pay your rent and support your family. So I think it would just really be meeting them where they are and maybe sending a hopeful message that when you're in survival mode, when you are just trying to get by, when you're dealing with life crises, that is resilience building. There's research out there that has looked at how many self-described personal crises students have been through and the relationship of that number to resilience. Students who have only been through 1 or 2 personal crises have very little emotional resilience. They're fragile. They're what a colleague of mine calls a snowflake. Not a very nice term, but they come apart pretty easily. 6 or 7 or more, they tend to be much more emotionally resilient. Up until like double digits, and then we're just starting to get into some bad life experiences. But I guess my point is, I would send a hopeful message about what they are doing to survive and get by, and how important that is to their personal, professional development, and the development of the kind of emotional resilience skills that are predictive of long-term success. Frame it for them.
Great. Tim, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about. Let's give a
You're
round of
welcome.
applause. So I want to invite everyone to take advantage of the networking opportunities and refreshments that are right outside in the foyer area, and the concurrent sessions will begin promptly at 10:45. Thanks, everyone.
Vicky, do you need help? That's 7 in front of the door.